Hi, everyone. Ever wondered why certain areas of Canada don't have any trees? No trees up in the Arctic, no trees, oh well, very few trees in the southern parts of the interior plains, whereas other areas have monstrous sized trees. If you take a look on the west coast of Canada, we have some of the biggest trees on the entire planet. So, we're going to examine the patterns of vegetation and talk about soil today. So, little matching exercise of what do you think each vegetation type is. So I'm pretty certain most people could take a look. Number one here for desert obviously would be this one over here. But now it gets a little bit trickier. So let's go for the next easy one. So semi-desert, the Bugs Bunny and the Roadrunner look here. So you got all the cacti. So you got some vegetation, but still extremely dry conditions. So we've got a treeless plain here, and we have a treeless plain over here. But if you look carefully, you can see the white on this one. So that white is frozen ground, or permanently frozen ground, or permafrost. So that must be tundra. Whereas over here, you can't really see it that well, but those are the grasslands. And then we've got a couple of different types of forests. You can't really tell how big these trees are, but they're about twice the height of the trees you'd find in this area. This is the boreal forest and the rocky conditions of northern Ontario. Whereas in British Columbia, they have nice deep soils in the valleys and they have these gigantic trees, which would make it, temperate rainforest. And then finally, we've got our deciduous forest, which is the smallest of all the vegetation zones in all of Canada, and that's where we live. So let's take a look at things. What are the two main things affecting what type of vegetation you'll have? Precipitation and temperature. So when we have extremely cold conditions, we have tundra. When we have hot and dry conditions, we have desert. And when we have wet and warm conditions, we have that temperate rainforest. And then we got sort of a mix in between. So if we take a look here in Canada, if you were to fly a plane from Baffin Island all the way down to the south, we'd start off by seeing an area with just shrubs and low growing plants, and that's our tundra. Extremely harsh conditions there. As we get further south into, for instance, northern Quebec or northern Ontario, we start seeing short, stubby trees. They're all typically conifer trees because of the short growing season, and that's our boreal forest. Now, if we were to head down over the plains, so for instance over northern Saskatchewan, we'd have some boreal forest in the northern parts of Saskatchewan, but grassland dominating the southern portion of the province. Whereas if we go further south in Ontario, we get into this deciduous forest. If we went far enough south in the United States, we'd hit deserts, so places like California and Utah. But in Canada, we don't really have any desert. We have a little bit of semi-desert in a few valleys of BC. But along a very small section of BC, we've got this temperate rainforest where we have our warmest or mildest conditions, and it's extremely wet. And that's this little section right here. We live down here. You can see the deciduous forest is very, very small. We just sort of take it for granted that it's commonplace, but most parts of Canada have either a mixture of conifer trees and deciduous trees, or are completely dominated by conifer trees, which is the biggest forest on the planet, the boreal forest, which extends over into Russia, which they call the taiga. So, deciduous trees, what are they? Well, they've got broad leaves typically, and they lose all their leaves in one season. Now, it's a little, we say typically because not every single broadleaf tree, or sorry, deciduous tree has broad leaves, and sometimes they don't lose them all in one season. But the ones that we're most familiar with, the oaks and the maples, that's how they perform. Conifer trees, on the other hand, they typically have needles, and they shed their needles slowly but surely throughout the entire year. And those are things like the white pine that's depicted here, very famous in the Group of Seven paintings, spruce trees that are commonplace in northern Ontario, and so on. Now, the other component that's going to determine your vegetation is the soil. And a good quality soil is going to have four parts to it. It's going to have some minerals, so things like nitrogen, phosphorus, um, and it's going to have organic material, so stuff that is decaying, so rotten leaves and fruits and so on. But also it could be dead animal material like dead worms and insects and all that sort of stuff. And that's what makes the soil dark in color. Typically, is the richer in organic material, which is really great for growing things. Um, the more or the darker the soil, the more organic material that's in there. Moisture, we've all experienced having a plant and forgetting to water it, and if that soil doesn't have moisture in it, the plant can't get its water source. And believe it or not, air spaces, because those what we call roots have to grow through air spaces in the soil, and you may notice that a lawn company will come along and poke holes in people's lawns. What they're trying to do is get air spaces in there, because if you're constantly walking all over your grass, you're compacting the soil and squeezing it out of those air spaces, and your grass is just not going to grow as well. So this is just sort of recapping all the key things that I just talked about. You know, nature has its own way of getting those air spaces in there. So we have all sorts of burrowing animals that create air spaces into the ground. And then, of course, we've got insects like worms and other types of burrowing insects that create holes in the ground. But farmers can do it artificially by plowing their fields too. All right. Just remember that sometimes we have water that's in the soil, but it's frozen. And that creates very difficult growing conditions, and hence why up in the Arctic we don't have many trees, because the roots can't extend very far down into the ground because we have all this frozen ice that's underneath it. All right. Enjoy.